Open inside Ruth's grief on the road with Naomi, not the romance, but the decision to stay. Ruth chose loyalty when she had nothing to gain, then settling into the lungs of those who remained. For Naomi, the famine was not just a season of hunger. It was a thief that took everything. First, the silence entered the house when her husband fell to the fever that swept through the valley. She buried him in the parched soil, the ground refusing to yield to the spade. Then, the sickness turned toward her sons. One by one, the life drained from them, leaving the house hollow. There were no voices left to break the stillness, no footsteps to echo against the walls. Naomi stood in the center of the room, her hands empty, the weight of 3 funerals pressing against her chest. She had crossed borders seeking a future, only to find a graveyard. The land had nothing left to give, and the promise of a lineage had been severed. She looked at the horizon, where the heat shimmered in waves, and realized that survival was no longer a matter of effort. It was a matter of endurance in a world that had turned its back on her. She was a woman alone. Naomi was not the only one left in the silence. Beside her stood 2 women, Orpah and Ruth, their own lives fractured by the same sudden absence. They were 3 widows in a land that measured a woman's worth by the men who stood beside her. Now, there were no men, no protectors, no voices to speak for them in the marketplace or the courts. They moved through the rooms of the house, their footsteps the only sound. They shared the same meager rations, the same dust-choked air, and the same terrifying clarity of their position. In the culture of the time, they were ghosts, women without a lineage, without a claim to land, and without a path forward. Naomi looked at the 2 younger women and saw the mirror of her own ruin. They were bound together not by choice, but by the absolute collapse of their world. Every morning, they woke to the same reality. The sun rising over a landscape that offered no work, no safety, and no hope for restoration. They stood in the doorway, staring out at the barren fields, 3 lives stripped of every layer of security, waiting for a future that had already been taken from them. Word reached the house that the famine in Bethlehem had finally broken. The fields were yielding grain again. Naomi heard the news, but it brought no relief to her heart. Instead, it sharpened the ache of her isolation. She sat on the floor, sorting through the few remaining items she possessed, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not see a path to restoration. She saw a cruel irony. To her, the return of the harvest was a reminder that life continued elsewhere. She felt the heavy hand of the Almighty pressing against her, not as a provider, but as an adversary who had stripped her bare. She spoke the words aloud to the empty air, her voice brittle with a deep, encroaching bitterness. She stood up, wrapping her thin cloak around her shoulders, and began to pack. She would return to the land of her people. She chose the road back, not out of hope, but out of a desperate, hollow necessity. Naomi stopped at the edge of the Moabite border, turning to face the 2 women who had followed her this far. She looked at their faces, seeing the youth that still remained in them, and then at the long, uncertain road stretching back toward Bethlehem. She spoke with a blunt, painful clarity. She told them to go back, to return to their mothers' houses. She offered them no promise of comfort, no hope of a future, and no security in a land where they would be perpetual outsiders. She urged them to find rest, to seek husbands among their own people, and to leave her to her own bitterness. Orpah hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where her home lay. She understood the logic of Naomi's words. Orpah stepped forward, pressed her forehead against Naomi's in a long, silent farewell, and then turned away. She walked back toward the familiar paths. The silence that followed was absolute. Only Ruth remained, standing motionless in the dust, her eyes fixed on Naomi. Naomi turned to Ruth, her voice sharp with the exhaustion of a woman who had nothing left to give. She gestured toward the path Orpah had taken, insisting that Ruth follow. She argued that there was no future in the direction they were heading. She told her to return to her kin, to her gods, and to the life she had known before the famine. But Ruth, did not move. She stepped closer, closing the gap that Naomi tried to widen. She reached out and gripped Naomi's arm, her fingers digging in with a strength that defied the older woman's rejection. When she spoke, her voice was steady, cutting through the wind. She told Naomi to stop asking her to leave. She declared that where Naomi went, she would go. Where Naomi lodged, she would stay. She tethered her own life to the older woman's path, promising that Naomi's people would become her own. Then, she made the final, irreversible claim. She vowed that Naomi's God would be her God. It was a total abandonment of her past, a rejection of the security of her homeland. The final miles to Bethlehem were marked by the thickening of the air and the rising heat of the valley. They walked until the stone gates of the town rose before them, a boundary between the life they had left and the reality they now faced. As they passed through the archway, the noise of the marketplace hit them like a physical weight. Naomi moved with her head bowed, her pace slowing as she navigated the familiar, yet now alien, streets. People stopped their work. They looked up from their stalls, their eyes tracing the lines of age and exhaustion on Naomi's face. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. They looked at Ruth, a stranger with the features of a Moabite, and their gazes turned cold. There was no welcome here. They stood in the center of the square, two women with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the dust of the road in their hair. Naomi felt the weight of every stare, a silent judgment that confirmed their status as refugees. They were home, yet they were entirely alone. The sun climbed high, turning the valley into a furnace. Ruth did not wait for an invitation. She left the small, cramped room they had found and walked toward the edge of the town where the barley field stretched toward the horizon. The work had already begun. Men and women moved in rhythmic lines, their sickles flashing as they cut the stalks. Ruth approached the perimeter, her eyes scanning the ground. She began to follow the reapers, bending low to pick up the stray heads of grain. The stalks were dry and sharp, cutting into her palms as she gathered them. She moved with a steady, relentless pace. Some of the harvesters glanced her way, their expressions guarded, but she did not look up. She kept her focus on the earth. Every time she gathered a small bundle, she tucked it into the fold of her belt. Her back ached from the constant motion. She stood, wiped the grit from her face, and looked back toward the town, ready to return with the day's hard-won provision. The heavy wooden gate at the edge of the field creaked open. Boaz walked onto the dirt path, his eyes scanning the rows of golden stalks. He moved with the measured gait of a man who owned the land but respected the labor required to sustain it. He stopped to speak with his foreman, checking the progress of the day. Then, his gaze drifted across the expanse of the field. Amidst the rhythmic swing of the reapers, one figure stood out. She was not part of his crew, yet she moved with a precision that caught his attention. She did not pause to wipe her brow or straighten her back, even as the sun dipped toward the hills. Boaz watched her for a long moment, noting the way she navigated the stubble, her hands working with a focused, quiet intensity. It was a stark contrast to the casual pace of others. He turned to the man beside him, pointing toward the edge of the field. "Who is that woman?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of genuine curiosity. The foreman glanced over, his expression shifting from indifference to recognition. Boaz did not look away. He saw the isolation of the worker. Boaz walked across the broken stalks until he stood only a few paces from her. Ruth stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She braced herself for the order to leave, for the harsh dismissal she had encountered in other fields. Instead, Boaz spoke with a steady, calm authority. "Do not go to any other field," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "Stay here with my workers. I have told the men not to touch you." He signaled to his harvesters. As they passed, they intentionally dropped handfuls of grain from their bundles, leaving a trail of stalks on the ground for her to gather. Ruth stared at the bounty. It was more than she could have gleaned in a week of backbreaking labor. She looked up at Boaz, her breath catching in her throat. The fear of hunger, which had been a constant gnawing weight in her gut, suddenly lost its grip. This was not just a fair wage, it was a deliberate, calculated act of protection. She knelt to gather the fallen grain, her fingers trembling as she touched the heavy heads of barley. The silence between them was no longer filled with the tension of an outsider, but with the shock of being seen and provided for. She had come expecting only the scraps of the harvest, but she was leaving with a promise of safety. Ruth returned to the small, dark room, her arms heavy with the day's bounty. She poured the grain onto the floor, the sound of falling barley filling the silence. Naomi sat up, her eyes widening as she saw the sheer volume of the harvest. She reached out, running her fingers through the stalks, and looked at Ruth with a sharp, searching intensity. "Where did you work today?" she asked. Ruth recounted the field, the protection of the master, and the name that had echoed through the rows. "Boaz," she whispered. Naomi's posture shifted instantly. The exhaustion that had defined her for months seemed to drain away, replaced by a sudden, electric clarity. She stood, her movements purposeful. "That man is a relative of ours," Naomi said, her voice steadying. "He is one of our kinsman redeemers." The term hung in the air, heavy with legal weight and ancient obligation. Night fell over the valley, thick and cooling. Ruth moved through the shadows, her footsteps silent against the dry earth. The threshing floor lay ahead, a flat expanse where the harvest was winnowed. She could hear the low, rhythmic breathing of men resting near the grain piles. Boaz was there, his work finished, his guard lowered in the heavy sleep of exhaustion. Ruth paused at the edge of the light, her heart thumping against her ribs. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back. She was an outsider, a woman alone in the dark, approaching a man of influence in a way that could be easily misinterpreted. She took a breath, the air smelling of crushed stalks and dust. She watched him for a long moment, the man who had offered her safety now lying vulnerable before her. The silence of the night felt absolute, where her entire future hung in the balance. She stepped forward, the crunch of a single straw sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness. She reached the spot where he lay, her hands steady despite the tremor in her knees. She knelt, her shadow falling across him, and prepared to speak. Boaz stirred, the sudden presence of another in the dark pulling him from sleep. He sat up, his hand brushing against the figure kneeling at his feet. "Who are you?" he whispered. When she spoke her name, the tension in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a deep, contemplative silence. He listened to a request, a plea for protection, and the restoration of a dead man's name. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim moonlight. He wanted to grant her wish, but he stopped. He leaned back, his brow furrowed as he calculated the implications of her words. "You have shown great kindness," he said. "But there is a matter that stands between us." He explained the law of the kinsman redeemer, a rigid structure that governed their lives. The air in the threshing floor grew heavy again, shifting from the intimacy of her request to the cold reality of the law. The morning sun climbed over the stone walls of Bethlehem as Boaz reached the city gate. This was the place of judgment, where the elders of the city sat to settle the affairs of the people. Boaz did not wait. He found the closer relative and gestured for him to sit. 10 elders gathered, their faces etched with the gravity of the law. The crowd began to murmur, sensing the weight of the proceedings. Boaz stood in the center of the circle, his presence commanding the space. He addressed the relative, his voice carrying clearly across the stone floor. "Naomi has returned from the land of Moab," he began, his eyes fixed on the man. "She is selling the portion of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech." The relative nodded, his interest piqued by the prospect of acquiring property. Boaz waited, letting the silence stretch until every elder leaned forward. He then laid out the full requirement of the law. To redeem the land was to also take the responsibility of the widow. The relative leaned back, his fingers drumming against his knee. He looked at the land, then at the elders, then back to Boaz. The initial allure of the property had been stripped away by the mention of the widow. He shook his head slowly. "I cannot redeem it," he said, his voice tight. "It would endanger my own inheritance." He looked at the ground, avoiding the eyes of the elders. He had calculated the cost of the duty and decided it was too high. He pulled a sandal from his foot and handed it to Boaz, the final, customary seal of his renunciation. The tension that had gripped the gate for hours snapped. A collective exhale rippled through the gathered men. Boaz took the sandal, his grip firm. He did not hesitate. The barrier that had stood between his desire and the law was gone. The path was open. He turned to the elders, his posture shifting from the restraint of a negotiator to the resolve of a man who had finally secured his future. The legal weight that had threatened to extinguish Naomi's line had been lifted, not by force, but by the relatives' own fear. Boaz stood taller, the weight of the sandal in his hand serving as the final proof. Boaz raised his voice, ensuring every elder and witness heard his words. "You are witnesses today," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the circle. "I have acquired from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and his sons. I have also acquired Ruth, the Moabite, to be my wife." The silence at the gate shifted into a murmur of approval. By taking her as his own, he had done more than settle a debt. He had grafted a stranger into the heart of the covenant. The elders nodded, their faces reflecting a rare, collective satisfaction. "May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah," one elder spoke, his voice steady and resonant. The legal transaction was complete, but the social transformation was profound. Ruth, who had arrived as a destitute refugee, was now a woman of standing, protected by the name and the resources of a man of integrity. Boaz stood among his people, no longer just a landowner, but a redeemer, who had risked his own future to secure hers. The gate, once a place of cold negotiation, now felt like a threshold of restoration. The wedding was a quiet affair, a simple binding of lives that had once been defined by loss. In the house where silence had reigned for years, the rhythm of daily life returned. Ruth managed the household with the same diligence she had once applied to the fields, while Boaz provided the security they had long lacked. Yet, the true shift occurred in the heart of the home. Naomi remained in the shadows, her hands still accustomed to the emptiness of her widowhood. The months passed, marked by the turning of seasons and the steady growth of their shared life. Then, the labor pains arrived, a sharp, urgent interruption. When the first cry of a newborn son pierced the air, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The midwife placed the infant into Naomi's waiting arms. She looked down at the small, breathing life, and the weight of her past finally lifted. Her fingers traced the soft features of the child. The house was no longer a place of memory, but a place of future. The restoration was complete. The empty arms were full. The story did not stop at the cradle of the small boy named Obed. The camera of history pulled back, revealing a path that stretched far beyond the walls of Bethlehem. Obed grew, and in time, he fathered a son named Jesse. The lineage continued, moving through the generations with a quiet, persistent momentum. Then came the day Jesse's youngest son, David, was anointed as the king of Israel. The realization struck with the force of a revelation. The blood of the Moabite woman flowed directly into the veins of the throne. Ruth, who had once been a destitute stranger gleaning in the dirt, now stood as the great-grandmother of the monarch who would define the nation. The law had not been a barrier, but a bridge. The outsider had not been excluded, but chosen. Every step she had taken in the fields, every choice to remain loyal to Naomi, had been a thread woven into a design far larger than her own life. The king of Israel did not descend from a line of pure, untouched royalty. He emerged from the broken, unexpected union of a redeemer and a refugee. The genealogy was a map of grace, tracing the path from a famine-stricken land to the very heart of the covenant. The small, ordinary act of a woman choosing faith had become the foundation for a dynasty. The pattern of this life was not an accident of fate, but a deliberate weaving of disparate threads. Every moment of famine, every night of mourning, and every step taken in the dust of foreign fields served a purpose that remained hidden until the end. This is how the work of the divine unfolds. It takes the shattered fragments of a human story and aligns them with a design that spans generations. The tragedy of Naomi was not the final word. It was the raw material for a greater restoration. Ruth, the outsider, found her place not by erasing her history, but by having her faithfulness integrated into the very structure of the covenant. This reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of grace. It does not wait for a life to be polished or perfected before it begins its work. It moves into the broken corners, the places of loss and abandonment, and claims them as its own. No one is too far from this reach. The tapestry is vast, complex, and deeply personal, proving that even the most desperate life is held within a larger, intentional design. We often look for the divine in the thunder, yet it arrives in the quiet rhythm of our daily bread. The story of Ruth teaches that our lives are not isolated incidents of chance. They are chapters in a narrative that stretches far beyond our current view. When the path ahead seems obscured by the dust of our own failures or the weight of our losses, we are not standing at a dead end. We are standing in the middle of a design that is still unfolding. Every small, faithful step taken in the dark contributes to a harvest we may never fully see. There is peace in knowing that our broken pieces are not discarded, but gathered. We are held within a story that is larger than our understanding. The work continues, the threads are being woven, and the story remains in steady hands. We are part of something that reaches into eternity, and that is enough.